Okay, right. So thank you very much, Adam, for joining the Network for Research into Chinese Education Mobilities, Meet the Author podcast. Can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Adam Poole, and I'm currently the Director of Research in the Institute of Impact Studies, which is part of Beijing Foreign Studies University. So my position is basically overseeing research in international schools and also helping out with some teacher training and also doing some support for teacher research.
Hmm, sounds very interesting. Yeah, and today our main purpose is really to talk about your forthcoming book with Palgrave Macmillan on international school teachers in China. So can you tell us a bit about what motivated you to conduct this piece of research?
Yeah, so it's kind of a bit of a long story. So I have to go back to when I first came to China. So I came to China in 2008. And originally I was going to stay for 1 year. So I went to a place called Nanchang in Jiangxi province. And I taught English in the university. So I ended up staying for 2 years. And then I decided, okay, I like China, I like teaching. I'm going to move to Shanghai and teach in the international school. So at that point, I had a master's degree, but I didn't have any teaching qualifications. But I managed to get this position in an international school in Shanghai. And I got some experience teaching the IB diploma. And then from there, I just basically moved from international school to international school. Along the way, I did a PGCE. And then eventually, after teaching in international schools in Shanghai for about 7 or 8 years, I decided, okay, I'm very interested in knowing about why is it that people like me end up in schools like this? Because I was meeting some very unconventional, I use the word unconventional kind of teachers. So these were people who didn't qualify as teachers in, say, the UK, but they ended up in China. And I was intrigued as to how is it that we all end up in this position and just very interested in knowing about their lived experiences. So basically, that was sort of the motivation in terms of actually the book and everything. So I did my doctorate, and that was looking at international school teachers and their identities. And what I found from doing the research, what was more interesting was not so much about their identities, but their kind of histories and their stories and their mobilities. And then that became the basis for the book. And as a result of doing the doctorate, I read a lot of literature, and I was kind of surprised to find there wasn't really anything on teachers. There's a lot of stuff on like types of international schools, the history of international schooling, students like third culture kids. And I was really shocked to find that there wasn't really anything on teachers, and the stuff that there was on teachers was very outdated and also a little bit, I would say, maybe a bit too simplistic, because it's all about very much about developing typologies and labels. So like calling teachers like a type A teacher, a type B teacher, a type C teacher. And then I was using my own lived experience as a teacher and thinking, I don't see myself or my colleagues in any of these labels or identities. And that really became a big motivation and inspiration for the book, was to sort of capture that reality of what it's like to really be a teacher in a school in China.
Yes, yes. And so in a sense, this is almost like a semi-autobiographical sort of motivation, right?
Yeah, I mean, and
Yeah.
that's an interesting thing. So when I wrote the doctorate, it was very much, I had my mind set on a very sort of objective kind of narrative. And in the back of your mind, I guess you know this from your experience, you always think of the examiner, and like
Mm-hmm.
I have to give them what they want, I have to write in a certain way. So I kind of like phased myself out of the doctorate. And
Mm.
then when I picked up the pieces again for my book, I actually decided, yeah, I really want to put myself back into this narrative.
Mm.
And that, you're right, there is a sort of semi-autobiographical aspect to it. And I think
Mm.
that was one of the liberating things about writing a book, was that I could sort of break some of the rules, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I was obviously with the doctorate, I was thinking very much in terms of, you know, being a little bit more objective, being a bit distant, trying to
Mm.
reduce the amount of times I used I and everything. Whereas for
Mm.
the book, it was very different. And
That's
it was,
fascinating, and that's something that we will discuss in greater depth soon. Yeah. So indeed, actually, I think you have already given us a sneak sort of preview of the key motivations or some of the key messages. But I still want to, give you an opportunity to think about or to talk about the key findings or messages that you want to convey through your book.
Yeah. So the main thing that I found, just to say a little bit more about the context, is I actually looked at 4 teachers, and that's like a very small sample. But like I said, I was very much interested in depth and not breadth. So I actually stayed with these teachers for about 4 or 5 years. So even after I submitted the doctorate, I stayed in contact with them. I got new interview data for the book, and it was actually a case of going very, very deep. So what I found with these 4 teachers is that I was interested in mapping the sort of different dimensions of lived experience. And that was very much about trying to get beyond those reductive labels and trying to look at the kind of nuance of the actual experience. So from the interviews and from our conversations and my own experiences, I identified what I call like 3 dimensions of lived experience. So one was the intercultural, the other was the precarious, and the other was the resilient. So I'll talk about each one of those. So in terms of the intercultural, I think this one's been written about the most in relation to international school teachers. It's about the adaptations that you make. Obviously, being in China, it's a very different country. A lot of the participants, such as myself from the UK, some from France, South Africa, and often it's about the ideal of the intercultural is adapting, is basically having that kind of synthesis of like, your views and then the views, and then you somehow create this third space or something like that. And that's very much like what I had in mind when I went into the book and everything. But what I found was, it was kind of the opposite. For some teachers, there's actually a failure to acculturate. And what happens is, essentially, they have these kind of frames of reference. And those frames of reference are often so, how should we say, so they're contradicted so much by the reality, because we're talking about Chinese internationalized schools. So these are not like international schools. So traditional international schools are very diverse. And actually, essentially, they're very Western in nature. When we talk about Chinese internationalized schools, we're talking about schools which are probably international in curriculum only, but for all intents and purposes, they are basically, if I use the word Chinese, that's a little too simplistic. But there's definitely a more monocultural environment, because most of the students are Chinese, most of the faculty are Chinese. So what I found with some of the expats that I interviewed was that rather than actually adapting, they would basically fall back very, very heavily on their, I guess you could call it ethnocentric thinking. And it's because they had an idea of what international education should be, and they equated that with diversity, with a traditional international school. And obviously what they found in the Chinese internationalized school was very different. And so actually it was the opposite. In terms of the intercultural, it was basically them using their, how to put it, using their maybe negative stereotyping, because that's what it basically amounted to. It's referred to as kind of cultural chauvinism. And actually, for them, it became almost like a form of defense, a form of armor, because their actual identities were very much under threat, or perceived to be under threat, because they came in with very fixed ideas about what they thought a school should be and what a teacher's role should be, and it was very different. So what I found was interesting enough that for those teachers, they could not adapt, and the experience just led to the retrenchment, basically, of stereotypical thinking. But there's also another participant called Sophie, and she adapted completely, because she actually was very receptive and positive to China, and she kind of understood the rules of the game. So there's very much like the idea of Bourdieu and sort of like field, and the idea of games and rules. And like for the other 2 participants, Tyrone and Robert, they just didn't understand the rules of the game. Whereas Sophie, she understood the whole idea, and she could speak Chinese. So she was able to adapt very well to that.
Do you think there's a gender aspect to it?
That's actually a very interesting point. So obviously my sample is so small. that it's very hard to make a sort of definite conclusion. But actually, when you mention that, it is true, because the two male participants both were characterized by that kind of cultural chauvinistic thinking, and the two female participants, so one was Sophie from France, and the other was Daisy, who was Chinese. Both very much more receptive, and Daisy was very much an example of a cultural mediator. So she really attempted to find a meeting point between these two worlds, between like the Chinese world and say like the Western world. It's very hard to not use these reductive labels when talking.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So actually, I think there is a point there that perhaps that definitely would warrant further investigation. Maybe like there is a gender difference there. But like I say, it suggests
maybe it's the next project. You can do a bigger sort of scale study and then explore the gender potential gender influence. Yeah.
And so that was the first dimension, the intercultural. And then the second one is the precarious, and that really was born from my own experiences of basically being on short-term contracts. So I think this is quite common for most international school teachers, that they'll be employed on like a 2 or 3 year contract. And so there's this idea of the precariat. So Guy Standing had this concept of people being on basically short-term contracts, not really having an anchor of stability, and really being in this kind of sort of existential kind of instability, as he calls it. And then actually, before I read his work, I had a sense of like what it was like as international school teachers and the insecurity, but I didn't really have a term for it. So as soon as I read Guy Standing's work on the precariat, it was like two bits went together. It was like, oh my God, yes, this is it. We teachers are part of the precariat. And so when I look at the theme of the precarious, it actually, you have to move beyond simply characterizing it in the negative. And that's something I found a lot of in the literature. Was it's very easy to sort of equate international school teaching with a sort of negative kind of experience. But I found that, so the negative aspects that I found were that often teachers are on these short-term contracts. For some teachers, it created a lot of anxiety because you have to renegotiate that contract. So if you have good guanxi with the school, and you have good connections and you know the rules of the game, it's very easy to renew that contract. And you have to make sure, of course, that the students like you and everything. But for some teachers, they were very anxious about that, and it almost became like one of the aspects of the precarious was about performativity. Like, am I performing as I should be as a teacher? Am I performing a version of myself that is going to be accepted by the students? And for me, I thought that was a sort of characteristic of, say, UK schooling, because we talk a lot about neoliberalism and performativity in UK schooling. And then what I found is, in relation to that theme, is that you kind of get the same thing in Chinese internationalized schools, but it takes on a slightly different feature, because a lot of the I think a lot of the stress comes from the parents, because these schools are for profit. So there's the idea of you've got to keep the customer satisfied. And that can actually cause a lot of anxiety and stress. So that was one dimension of the precarious, of the precariat. And also found that the stress of like moving on as well was quite difficult. So moving
on in what sense?
Moving on to another school. Because one of the participants, called Tyrone, his story was it's quite emotional, because he was from South Africa, and so his story is quite long. So he wanted to become an academic. He had a PhD. So he and his family relocated to Canada, and he was doing a postdoc there. And then the postdoc basically fell through, and he had no job. And then one of his contacts told him about a position in China. So then his family went back to South Africa. He couldn't get a job in South Africa. Okay. So he went to China. And was away from his family. And then for him, so like, he's in a weird bind, because on the one hand, he doesn't want to be away from his family. And that also feeds into the idea of precarity, because, there's a sense of like isolation and loneliness. On the other hand, he's on these short-term contracts as well, and he needs to be in China because he's got 4 kids, and they're at the age where they're starting to go to university. So he's in this situation where he's got to stay teaching in international schools because that's the best paying position for him. And it seems like that's going to work for him in terms of his situation. So that dimension there in terms of the sort of insecurity and unpredictability came through. But I do want to stress that a better way of looking at precarity is another concept called precarious privilege. So this is not a concept I came up with, but some writers called Ray et al. From a paper last year. And that really captures, I think, the kind of contradictory nature of being an international school teacher. Because on the one hand, you are in a situation of precarity, right? Because you're often locked into the system. You can jump from school to school, but you can't really get out of it because you get so used to this kind of lifestyle. And that's where the privilege comes in. Salary is very good. The holidays are excellent. And it's almost like you can become seduced, as it were, by this lifestyle. Because imagine if you were to move back to your home country. For Tyrone, for example, he's very much, in the middle class as an international school teacher. But if he were to move back to South Africa, he suddenly would maybe move down. He'd become unemployed. And so that was an interesting thing, like looking at this sort of the ambivalent nature of it, where on the one hand it is quite stressful, quite precarious. On the other hand, the privileges tend to keep people out there in the schools themselves. So that's very much a sort of one side of it is a bit negative. And then the third theme is what I call the resilient. So that theme was really important, and that was not there in my doctorate. So when I did the doctorate, I really focused more on the intercultural. And then through my interviewing for the book, I actually found that the narratives of surviving were not just surviving, but also thriving. So it's very interesting. So I wanted to actually add a more positive dimension. So originally I was just going to have this doom and gloom narrative, right? So it's just like the struggles of being a teacher. And I thought, no, that's not the lived reality. The lived reality is it's difficult. But then also looking at some of the strategies that the teachers have for developing resilience. And some of those strategies are quite interesting. I'll just mention that.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Because just now when you were talking about the precarious privilege, it made me also think about the sort of racial hierarchy, the global sort of. I mean, are your participants all white people speaking English as their native language? Yeah.
No, actually, no. That's the interesting thing. Tyrone was Afrikaans, so English was his second language. Sophie was French, so English was her second language. Daisy was Chinese, so English was her second language. And Robert was originally from South Africa, and then he emigrated to New Zealand. So actually, interestingly enough, like most of the participants are not like classic Anglo-Saxon white. And actually what I found is like these schools, these Chinese internationalized schools, tend to have more of a split between, say, your classic white Anglo-Saxon face, like mine, for example, and maybe teachers whose English was their second language. And it seemed that those schools were more willing and more receptive to hire those types of teachers. Whereas your traditional international school, there is still a bias towards hiring British and American teachers.
I see. That's very important, because to me, I think that's very important, because just now you're talking about the perks of these internationalized schools. So they have like a high salary and good holidays. So these are probably not easily accessible for let's say public schools or in China, for instance.
And that's why I think, for example, for Daisy, she being in an international school was actually quite great for her because she didn't have much experience. So I found that with these schools, it is possible, like in my own case, I didn't have much experience, but I could use that as a sort of like piggyback to something else. And that's the thing about these schools. So what I also wanted to do with the book is to actually try to move beyond labeling them as inferior international schools, that's how they're portrayed. Often they're described in terms of like non-traditional or underbelly and things like that. And actually what I tried to do is actually understand them on their own terms. And what I found interestingly was that ethnic capital, so that would be an individual's embodiment of, say, an imaginary of Western whiteness, is actually far more important for these types of schools and the clientele, which would be middle-class aspirant Chinese families, than perhaps professional capital. So by professional capital, I mean like teaching qualifications. So basically most of the teachers in the case study school that I investigated, and I worked in as well, so that's an interesting thing, I actually worked in the school, they didn't have teaching qualifications. But that not to say they weren't good teachers, they were all fine teachers, but that's the point, is that in these schools, it's their actually embodiment and performance of an ideal that was actually more important. And that can get very frustrating. I know myself as a teacher, which is one of the reasons why I left teaching, actually, because you often felt that, I had like, my PGCE, I had a lot of teaching experience, and often you felt that maybe that wasn't really what was important. What was important was that you represented an international dimension.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
It's a bit of a devil's bargain. It's like, okay, for these advantages I'm going to get, I enter into this kind of bargain that I will be essentially objectified, but but at the same time, it's like a double exploitation, because actually expatriate teachers get paid way more money than local teachers.
So Daisy was paid less, you mean?
Yes, much. So Daisy was, so for Daisy, I think her thinking was very strategic. So she was like, I don't have much teaching experience, and this position is going to exploit me, and I know it, but I need to get that experience to be able to move on to something else.
Okay.
I didn't ask her salary. I never spoke about money. It's one of those things that, but there was a tacit understanding that the expatriates were on a higher salary.
Yes.
And that can cause a lot of friction. That comes back to the precarious privilege again. The idea that your identity is often under threat as a professional educator if you perceive yourself that way. But then there's also the advantages. So it's and that's why I wanted to move beyond these labels, like calling a teacher. For example, some of the labels were quite funny. They call teachers like mavericks. That's one label that's been used. Like a maverick is like a teacher who is a bit wild and unpredictable, and like has left their home country just to sort of like travel around and be like an adventurer. And there's more to it than that.
I see. That's why you explore the idea of resilience.
Yeah, and so that's the thing, is like despite the fact that people have this quite difficult experience, what is it that keeps them in the field, in the arena of internationalized schooling? And there is a big distinction between internationalized and international. So I'm talking about the internationalized. So basically these private, for-profit, bilingual schools. And some of the strategies were quite interesting. So for Tyrone, for example, talked a lot about fitness. And this is something that you think wouldn't be important, because you're thinking in terms of high concepts. So maybe you're thinking in terms of classic resilience, which is like bouncing back and stuff. But he talked a lot about saying that I have control of my diet. He said, if I can have control of my diet, I can have control over my school life as well. So and that was interesting. It's almost like suggesting that they felt that they didn't have any control of what went on in school. And that was just something they had to accept. But what they could control was some stuff outside of school. And that became actually really important for surviving. So someone like Tyrone, like controlling his diet, actually helped him stay on the tracks. And actually, I think most people who've taught in international schools will have met some teachers who have derailed at some point. And there were some teachers in the school, like where I got the data from, who left. There were many teachers who left. Some like left in the middle of the night. They just packed their bags and didn't run out. Yeah. Some teachers, they just let. And because it comes back to that issue of your self-perception And then the reality, which is, you know, you're valued for your ethnic capital, perhaps. And those teachers who could accept that reality did very well. Those teachers who couldn't, obviously, just, I guess, fled. And actually fleeing becomes a strategy. That is a form of resilience, but in a way, it's not dealing with the actual situation. It's just sort of deferring it. And Robert, for example, he did a lot of fleeing, so he kept moving from school to school. Like almost every year, he would change because he wouldn't budge. He just would not budge. He said, "This is who I am as a teacher. This is what international school teaching is, and this is how it's got to be." So obviously, when he started working at internationalized school, it's more monological, monocultural, and that's not a critique. That's just the reality, right? That is how these schools are, and you have to accept that, I think. And so one way for him to survive was basically just to move on and move on and move on. And his situation was quite hard because he was approaching retirement age as well. So he couldn't keep doing that. So he ended up just going back to New Zealand.
This sounds fascinating. I really want to read the book. You know, yeah, that's fascinating. So when you were conducting this piece of research, I mean, both during a PhD or after, was there any interesting anecdotes that you could share?
Yeah, you know, I thought about this question so much for the last like 3 or 4 days. I was like, and I can't actually think of anything specifically for the book, but definitely for the doctorate. So actually, originally with my doctorate, I was going to do a very different study. I was actually going to look at something called funds of knowledge, which is basically a sort of approach to helping marginalized students and accepting their knowledges and their experiences as equal to the kind of knowledge you get in the classroom. So originally I was going to do my thesis on that, but there were some issues. It didn't happen because it was a little bit sensitive, because it was going to be on some like ethnic minority groups, and it just didn't work out in the school. So basically there was a moment during my doctorate where the whole thing fell through. And I was like, oh my God, I have to quit my doctorate, and I didn't know what to do. And then my supervisor, Bob Adamson, really wonderful guy, I went to him and said, Bob, what am I going to do? Like I can't do funds of knowledge now. It's over. And I was so depressed. And Bob's just like, very coolly was just like, what are you interested in? And I was like, oh, I'm interested in being a teacher. What's the identities of teachers? And he's like, well, that's a good idea. I think you should go with that. And I was like, and then literally from that little seed grew my project. So actually, it's very interesting how like the project. In fact, it's very serendipitous, because I feel that if I had done the Funds of Knowledge project, I wouldn't have written this book. I wouldn't now be a researcher researching international schooling. I'd be a researcher researching funds of knowledge. So actually, I feel that in a way that was a good thing that happened, and very sort of unexpected, but with a very positive outcome. That I ended up writing the book because I couldn't do the project I wanted to do.
That's fascinating, and it also shows the key role that your supervisor played at that time, right?
Yeah, and that's what I learned about supervisors. And like if and when I become a supervisor, like I think every relationship is slightly different. And I think with Bob Adamson, we got on very well, because he sort of knew that I was very self-directed, and I was very determined, and I knew what I wanted to do. And he's very much there to like, okay, keep me on track, keep me encouraged. And that really worked very well for me. And just like for example, just being very rational about it and saying, what are you interested in? And it's like, well, I thought it was amazing how such a small thing could just bring the whole project together. It was like, wow, that's someone who's very experienced.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fascinating. So many of our network members are also interested in the publication processes of a book, or indeed articles, which you have both. So can you tell us a bit about how you went about proposing this book to Palgrave Macmillan, for instance, and what were the highlights or challenges of getting this book published?
Okay, so I feel like everything about the book and my research is like a story. So there's always like it's slightly unexpected. So originally, I finished my doctorate, and I continued teaching in international schools for about 1.5 years. And I always knew I was going to move to like academia. And then, there's that thing after you finish a doctorate where you say, okay, I need to turn it into a book now. So I didn't get around to it. And then during the pandemic, because we were in lockdown, this must have been in April, May time. Around about that time, I had a lot of free time because of the lockdown. So I turned my mind to writing this proposal. And I went onto Twitter, and I basically said on Twitter, I'm thinking of reaching out to publishers. Anyone know of any good publishers for publishing from your thesis? And then one academic got back to me and recommended Polity Press, which I think is Bristol University.
Yeah.
Because I think he published with them, and he had quite good experience. And then from Palgrave, one of the editors, Linda Browse, just contacted me and said, oh, if you're interested, you should send your proposal to me. And she was very encouraging and positive. So I thought, okay, I'll try Palgrave. So originally I was going to submit what's called a pivot book. So that's like a shortened form. So it's about 40 to 50,000 words. Because originally I just thought, I want to do the book and I don't want to take too long over it. I just want to get that thesis into a book and move on to something else. So I kind of sat down and did the pivot proposal. And I sent it off. And then Linda, before she sent it to the reviewers, she got back to me. And she said, you know what, I think this would be better as a full-on book. Because actually there's a lot of ideas you have here. And because originally the layout of the book was very different. So the book that, as it stands now is those 3 dimensions. The intercultural, the precarious, the resilient. Originally that wasn't there. It was basically Robert's narrative, Daisy's narrative, Tyrone's narrative, Sophie's narrative. It was very much a narrative inquiry. And there wasn't really any of those concepts there. So that was what I went with originally. So anyway, I developed it, sent it off, and waited and waited and waited, as you know. Actually, but it wasn't too long. I think, if I remember rightly, the reviews came in quite quickly. And I was very surprised because, obviously when you write your proposal, you go online and you look at all the horror stories, of like, a year or something. And actually, Linda was really amazing because she kept emailing me all the time saying, okay, the reviewers are just looking at your, the proposal, they'll get back to you. So ultimately the proposal came back and they said, yeah, it's got potential, but we want a major revision. And, I was okay with that. I was like, having published some papers before, and having papers rejected, you get used to like having to make big changes. So at that point, and one of the reviewers said, like having your narratives the way they are, it's just not that robust, and perhaps there's not much substance there. Because one of the things I really wanted to do with the book, and that was a tension I still haven't quite resolved, is wanting to get the voices of the teachers to be at the front of the book and trying to get the concepts and the theory to be at the back. And so, but anyway, I sort of thought, well, there's probably too much teacher voice here, not enough theory. So I basically decided to weave the narratives together across those 3 themes. And that actually gave the book some really strong coherence. So actually, as a result of that, I redid the proposal, and then I had to rewrite a chapter submission as well because that didn't go down very well. It seems to be like the story of my life. Like the first attempt is not very good, and the second attempt spot on. So I find that that's just a pattern. So whenever like anything goes wrong, first of all, I'm like, it will be okay. Just keep going.
Exactly.
So I sent that one back, and then they gave me a contract. They said, this is wonderful, this is great, please write the book. So I actually wrote the book very quickly. It took me about 2 or 3 months to write the book.
Wow.
And I pretty much wrote the book from the bottom up. I ditched my thesis because I don't know about you, but when you write the thesis, you think it's the best thing in the world. And then after about 6 months, you look at your thesis again and you start to scratch your head and think, oh, I could have done so much more with that. So basically, and I realized that I'd grown and changed as a researcher, and my voice had changed as well. I was trying to reach for a more authentic voice as a kind of teacher researcher. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go into the book with a very liberated kind of approach. So I'm just going to write the way I want to. And that was great. Then what I did is I brought in a lot of poetry, because actually my background isn't education, it's English literature. So for like my undergraduate and my master's degree, I studied literature. So I'm especially interested in poetry. And I always, originally that was my style. And then I phased that style out and I put the poetry back into the book. It was very liberating. And I really
Wow, so that's fascinating. So you mean in your writing, you also inserted some poetry?
Yeah, so basically, in fact, I realized that that's really what I've been doing in terms of my data analysis. Like whenever I analyze interviews, it's basically the way I'd analyze a poem. And that's basically discourse analysis, where you're actually looking at the words in context, you're teasing out the sort of, you're digging into the sort of hidden meaning of the words, the symbolic force of the words. And I realized that, okay, that's something that's always been there. So I kind of brought it all together. And so that's why I think I could write the book very quickly. And it just came together. And I interviewed some of the participants again. So I got fresh data, which is really amazing. And that's where the third chapter came from, the resilient, from new interviews. And then, so the book got written, and then I sent it back to the publisher. And then within like a month or so, they sent it out for a clearance read. They said, great, fantastic. Now, yeah, your book will get published. So it's quite amazing. I was like, wow, I got this book. And,
yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and it seems to me that the book, the publication itself was also quite a journey for you to like mature intellectually and as a writer, right?
Yeah. I mean, what it taught me is that you have to establish your own voice. And that's one thing that really came out of the book, was the idea of voice and representation and authenticity. And it's not just about like when in the book, when I'm talking about writing, trying to get the lived experiences of teachers, it's actually realizing that your positionality as a researcher needs to be commensurate with that. You cannot like stand over that kind of aim with a sort of objective stance. And I think most qualitative researchers reject that anyway. But what it taught me is that I shouldn't be ashamed. And also called for like a new kind of epistemology, which is like, you know, teachers, they have certain kind of knowledge and experiences that are equal to the knowledge that's generated by academic researchers. And, you know, the point is to find some kind of meeting ground. And I think, yeah, it helped me mature anyway. I kind of moved from being a teacher and being a researcher, and there was this kind of new positionality between.
That's fascinating, fascinating. So in addition to this book, I know that you have been publishing a lot of articles. So can you sort of talk a bit about how you navigate the publication of articles and a book? You know, what are the main strategies, especially for early career researchers?
Yeah. So there are a couple of strategies that I've developed, and I think they really work for me and my kind of my working style. So the first thing I tend to do is I tend to work on one paper, just one paper, very, very intensely. So what I mean is like I will pour everything into that one paper, and I will try not to work on anything else. And then usually I will spend about 2 or 3 weeks just like, I almost liken it to like working in a mine, and you're like chipping away at the coal face. And it's almost like my mentality is a kind of stubborn refusal. It's like I will stick at this paper, even if the paper is not going where I want it to go. And I will just keep, so that's one tactic that works for me. So basically that is working on self-contained projects and not trying to overlap too many papers. This has changed now. Like before, because I was just on my own, I had no collaborators or anything. I was just literally, I had no connections. I was just a teacher writing academic papers. And so that was one that I was forced basically to adopt that kind of strategy to be able to complete the project. So I guess one is a stubborn refusal. Another is like is to actually make some connections with other academics. So that can also help you write more papers and ease the burden of actually having to write so much. Because actually there is a thing that when you write a paper and it's just you, and if that paper gets rejected, it's really quite painful because you've poured so much into that paper. And so I reached out to a researcher called Tristan Bonnell from the University of Bath. And he's like one of the leading researchers in international schooling. And for me, like before I reached out to him, he was almost like in my mind. It sounds really strange to say this. He was kind of like on this pedestal, because he's like this name I've been reading all through my doctorate, Tristan Bono, and his work had informed my work so much. And I was really hesitant to reach out to him. And one thing I do recommend to researchers, early career researchers, is don't be like me. Don't be hung up. Please, because I've had actually a lot of PhD candidates reach out to me. And I'm always like, wow, I'm so surprised at how confident they are. And they're just so open. And that's one bit of advice I would give is don't be afraid to actually reach out. So anyway, I reached out to Tristan Bono and I read one of his papers. And I said, I have some data that I think fit really well with that. And then basically since that time, we've written maybe 5, 6 papers and co-authored a book together.
Wow.
As well. So, and
you are highly productive. You know that, right? You're extremely productive.
Well, yeah, but then that's what I mean. So like being, again, it's that kind of mentality of, I don't know, it's like chopping things up and saying that is a project. And that's a project, and never letting them come together. But I think the thing with Tristan Bono as well is that me and him have a very similar work ethic, which is we tend to like work on something very quickly but intensely. So like we always throw emails back to each other and like, oh, this bit. And I did collaborate with somebody else, a good friend of mine, and she's very different. And that's no criticism of her, but she takes a long time, a very long time to do anything. And I realized that my tempo for working is very, very fast. So I think that's another bit of advice is if you're going to collaborate with other people, it's good to find someone who actually fits your kind of working style.
Totally. Yeah, totally. It makes your life more enjoyable as well.
Yeah, because it's kind of you don't want to like have written something and then pass it off to someone and then you're waiting 2 months to get the paper back. Because again, that's something that I like to do is I almost like to finish a project, finish a paper, and then it's done. Like I've done that paper, I finished it, and then I can move on to the next thing and then give myself completely to it. So that's another thing is basically making networking and collaborating. And that's something that I only started doing in the last year, I have to say. So that's worked quite well. And I think another way of doing it, I think another way to sort of get the big picture of your writing is to see all of your papers as telling a story. And I think that's really important as well, like to sort of, even when you're writing, even beginning to write a paper, almost think of it as a sequel or a prequel to something that came before. And I find that very helpful for me, that sometimes I'm telling a story and it's like one paper is chapter 1, the next paper is chapter 2, and there's always a kind of development that goes on, and making that link, that also makes it, if you can get that straight in your head, then I think that's more persuasive for reviewers to see the contribution that the paper is making.
Certainly. Wow, these are some really, really good tips. Yeah. What are your next steps for this very fascinating project?
Yeah. So in terms of the stuff covered in the book, that for me, that's like the end of that now. It's like I'm done with that. Like it was wonderful. It's great. I need to leave that behind. One thing that I've become very interested in as a result of my job is actually language teacher research. So this is teachers as researchers. And so because in my position, I've helped support teachers doing classroom research. And I've actually did publish one paper on that. So that's like a new kind of world for me, because I'm very much versed in international schooling. And it's very interesting to step into this new world of language teachers and language teachers as researchers. So that's something I definitely want to develop, and particularly looking at teachers' conceptions of research. Because what I found interestingly is that a lot of teachers have an idea of research which is very grand. It's almost like scientific research. They think in terms of like large samples and representativeness and this kind of thing. And classroom research itself is actually very modest, and it should be. And actually at the moment, I'm also designing a course as part of my job for teacher researchers. So I see that developing into some research. I'm also getting connected with like my work with like working class academic research. So I just attended the conference the other day for working class academics, which you recommended to me last year, as I remember. And at that point, I wasn't ready for it because, you know, I was like, am I a working class academic? Because I am from a working class background, or at least I self-identify as being from a working class background. And for a very long time, it was something that I didn't think there was any reason to acknowledge that in my research about it. I think that's something I definitely like to investigate next. And maybe even looking at working class teachers in international schooling.
That would be interesting. I'm not aware that there's anything that's been done in this area. That would be very interesting.
I feel like there's a lot of scope there for like mobility. So the idea of these Chinese internationalized schools, not necessarily needing to be a qualified teacher. So there is a sense of like being able to move into the global middle class. So like, for example, for me, I came from a working class background and worked very hard to get to university and everything. And in a way, the traditional route into academia was not really going to work for me, but these alternative routes, and you can get to the same place, but you have to take the B road, as it were. And I'm very much interested in looking at, and also looking at the juxtaposition of the elite, the kind of elite nature of international schooling, and how that might sit with teachers who are from a working class background.
That would be a fascinating piece of research. Yeah, that would be, that sounds so exciting. Incredible. So is there anything else that you would like to share with us today before we close the interview?
Not really, just very happy to come on and talk about the book.
Yeah, so is there any sort of promotion information about your book? Like, do you have a leaflet or do you have like promotion code?
Yeah, so there is a leaflet which I can make available. So that's basically Palgrave advertising it. I have also got a PPT presentation, which, because I gave a talk about my book, and I think at some point I should probably record it. I haven't done that yet, so that's available as well. So yeah, there is some information about the book.
So if you know, like, do give this information to us so we can promote the book for you as well. So thank you very much, Adam. It has been a great pleasure talking to you about your exciting book and your exciting projects. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.